what a wonderful group this is. I was just saying to James how much I really love this clean language, clean change work. I love it because there's space in it, and it's alive and it's fun, which is not to say that it's not serious. So before we get started, I just wanted to say a few words of introduction, but before we do that, let's check on the sound in this room. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Do you want me to use a microphone? Yes. Okay.
Try it and see.
We're going to try it and see. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. When I was speaking with Wendy Sullivan about what to bring today, we talked, of course, about metaphor. And metaphor is at the center of my father's work and my work, as you will see if you haven't seen this film before. As a point of curiosity, how many people in this room have seen this film before? Okay. And how many have read Bateson? Brave souls. So Gregory Bateson's work was actually, as I have come to learn, the fruit that came from his father's work. Now, this is something I didn't really understand until the last couple of years. Gregory's father, William, was the person who coined the term genetics. And even though I have a brash and garish American accent, my ancestors were in fact English. And William and Gregory both came from Cambridge. William said something very interesting in about 1902. He said, in his studies of genetics and inheritance in biology, he said the evolution comes from context. So even though this was the very beginning of genetics, William Bateson, or WB, as we refer to him, was often running on what would later be called cybernetics, what would one day be called systems theory, complexity theory, epigenetics. And he was already getting to the question then of what's happening in the interrelationships between organisms in an environment. What's happening in an organism in the interrelationships between the parts of that whole? And when you really start to think of it, where's the edge of the context? Which parts are the parts and which parts are the wholes? So these are not easy questions. They're questions that lift off very quickly into a kind of abstraction that makes your head spin and you start to think, oh my God, how am I going to keep track of all that? But nevertheless, in the early 1900s, WB starts looking at contextual evolutionary development. So Cambridge actually gave him the first chair in genetics because it was his term. And he was at Cambridge teaching, and his father had been at Cambridge. But WB refused it. And he refused it because there was a kind of love affair emerging at that moment with something that we would call the chromosome theory. Now, nothing wrong with the chromosome theory, said WB, only that's not all the information. So the problem with the chromosome theory is it's way too linear. That's the information about the organism. That's okay. You need that. But what about the context? What about the environment? What about the fact, and this is what W.B. predicted, that you'll lose 100 years of research if you go chasing that chromosome theory. You're going to go looking for something that we now call DNA, and you're going to miss all the other ways of looking at how the relationships themselves develop and define the context. Okay, so if those of you who have read Gregory have ever tried to read William, you'll know that by comparison, Gregory's work is a walk in the park. That is, of course, a serious word of warning. It's difficult going, that William Bateson material. But worthwhile. And he's coming back. So, today I want to talk about metaphor. And I'd like to discuss with you a little later in this program some of the metaphors that make us interested in chromosome theory. What happened there? Why did we spend 100 years? And what does it mean now when we like to say we're all interconnected? How does that actually manifest? What does that mean? It's easy to look at that kind of rhetoric, which we've become accustomed to, and I'm grateful for that because it gives us a kind of one rung up on the ladder of understanding the way that our ecology works, our communities function, our families function. This notion of interconnectedness is very useful at one level, but it's not enough. If you think of what it is to be interconnected, and you close your eyes, and you see, maybe, some dots, and some lines between some dots, and those dots are interconnected. And they can crisscross, and they can all touch each other, and the lines can go everywhere, and it makes a big mess to interconnect all those dots. And we can look at that big mess and we can say, that's complexity and it's a mess. Actually, complexity is messier. Because instead of lines between those dots, what if you were to put wild, living, electric squiggles that are moving and changing and shifting color, shifting shape, shifting thickness, shifting directions, shifting tempos, growing, learning? What if the space between the dots is not lines, but relationships? And then what we're looking at is no longer something that sits on the two-dimensional page as a big giant geometry problem, but something that is swirling in 3 dimensions, at least, of learning, of interacting, of caring, of connecting, of interlocking, of emerging, of dying. So, all of this to say, I'm inviting you to enjoy this film today that I made about my father. And the thing about making a film about your father is that in the end it's a film about relationship, isn't it? And his work was about interrelationship. And at the very subtle core of that is the question of how do we describe a relationship? What's our responsibility in the description of a relationship? So that we don't describe it in such a way that that description is finite, how can I begin to describe my father in a way that won't kill him? That the relationship that we have can continue to grow, that I can continue to learn things, that his work can continue to find place in the world. How do you describe a relationship so that the metaphors stay alive? And that was my task in making this film. And it was, in fact, his task in his work in terms of how do you describe living systems? How do we perceive and describe and interact with multiple domains of relationality so that we can make sense of them and not kill them? Not lock them down, not ossify them or rigidify them or put them in boxes, no matter how tempting that might be. How can we begin to get more information about the world that we live in so that we make a few fewer mistakes in the way that we interact? That's really where we're going. You will see that I have made this film from the first person, and that is an important part of the film. Because my frame is the frame through which I can see and describe. If I were to try to give you an objective perspective, I don't think there's any way that I could ethically do that. There's no possible way for me to be objective about my relationship with my father. Not gonna happen. There's no BBC4, no Channel 4 voice of God. Gregory Bateson was a nocturnal creature, feeding mostly upon small animals. I can't give you Gregory Bateson. I can only give you my Gregory Bateson. And I hope that you will enjoy this film and we can talk further about where these metaphors are going and how we're playing with them. This is very much related to clean change, but it's a little different too. So, one of the terms that I used in the description of this day is the description of invisible ink. And I want to invite you while you're watching the film today to start engaging with that. Where am I going with this? What do you mean invisible ink? And start to, as you're watching, see what Gregory's describing, what's happening in Gregory's work that provides maybe a reveal to something we didn't see before or we didn't have language for before. Because of course the thing about invisible ink is that something is written. It's not that it's not written, it's that we can't see it. So I very carefully chose that as a metaphor to play with today. And I want to invite you to just begin the thinking on that. We can start the film, and I just wanted to let you know that I did bring some, if you want them. And you can order them on Amazon.uk, and they're cheaper than I can sell them to you for, because the person that's selling them on there has got them illegally. And this is the world we live in. So I think that's enough to get us started. And enjoy. Thank you. And it's funny because to describe his life is actually to describe a sort of fragmented fits and starts that went through various professions and various worlds and never kind of went anywhere. He started off studying zoology at Cambridge, and then went to New Guinea and became an anthropologist. And he met there Margaret Mead, and they were subsequently married. They were in New Guinea in the very early days of anthropology, in their early 30s, late 20s, and went on from there to Bali to study in Ubud and Bantuan, and did some incredible ethnographic work. As you might recall, in that era, there was an emergence of fascism. So the study of anthropology at that exact moment in time is an interesting pursuit. And their work was very much motivated by an agenda to bring to the Western world a kind of story, a kind of evidence, a kind of picture of a different way of looking at other cultures, to show that there was, in fact, intelligent, complex community, education, arts, sophisticated life happening in these places. Because at that moment, what was emerging was, you may recall, eugenics. Gregory and Margaret were very, very against eugenics, especially with Gregory's father having coined the term genetics. You can imagine how close to home this was for him, that body of science should begin to get twisted into those forms. So after the war, they came back, and Gregory was British, as you have seen, and Margaret was American. Margaret went back to the US, and she got a job working for the government doing really beautiful things. She helped with conversation, she helped with cross-cultural understanding. She had a good war. And Gregory came to Britain, and he tried to do the same thing here, but nobody quite knew what to do with him. What is it that you're good at? So that didn't work out very well for him, and he went also to the US to go work with the OSS, which later became known as the CIA, and he did not have a good war. His job during the war was to escalate and to minimize messages so that the sense-making that would happen on one end of the relationship or the other would get tangled up. Okay? So this is a person for whom communication and relationship is the sacred territory of life itself. And this process was enormously depressing for him. He would have done anything he possibly could
as a child
to stop fascism. So from there, they began to develop information theory. Obviously, there were a group of really radical intellectuals: Gregory, Margaret Mead, von Neumann, McCulloch. There were a whole group of these people, and their conversations actually started in the 30s. So by the time information theory was really developing in the 50s, they were already well into what would later be called cybernetics, systems theory, complexity, and so on. And what I would like to share with you now is that in a recent trip I just took to the Library of Congress, I found all these letters written. And the thing is they were so deeply concerned about what would happen if fascism took hold, that what they wanted to do was develop a new way of making sense of our world that would defragmentize it. And that was what became known as cybernetics later on. But in the 30s, this conversation began, and it began as has a concern amongst these intellectuals about how to develop a new way of knowing in our world that would not be confined by the silos of the disciplines. Now, what they later came to create in the 50s through the Macy conferences was cybernetics. And if you've studied anything about cybernetics, you may have a kind of distant, it has a kind of a cold feel to it, okay? It's beautiful and it's incredible, but it's sort of the providence of academia and an intellectual world and a pursuit of kind of high-end philosophical mathematics that maybe became the internet. It's, I think, vital to remember that, in fact, that whole field of inquiry came from concern. We are now ready to do this again. So I can continue later. Why don't we skip forward to where we were? Do you want me to do that? Or you got it? Thank you. Bien, Clyde.
Yeah, Clyde.
There should be a timeline. There you go. Where were we? 7:41. 7:41. Thank you for noticing.
Just wanted to notice.
Approximately 7:41. We'll start at 5:17, just to cover our bases. So welcome back. And since this is one of those days where we've left the program, I say we just continue with that. And I think that it might be nice, first of all, to invite you to feel free to make any comments or ask questions. What came up for you? What resonated for you? What might be bubbling for you about the film, or that you would want to ask me about?
My name's Ian. I'd like to know more about Gregory's thinking about the relationship between biological systems and non-living systems. How would you view patterning across that boundary or within that construct? Are you saying?
This is a great question, and actually this is what I'm doing right now. I just set up an institute for research and seminars and filmmaking and so on in Stockholm, called the International Bateson Institute, and the website's not even up yet, it's that fresh. But tomorrow morning I'm dashing to Italy because it's taking wind quickly and coming to life more quickly than actually I was ready for. And the premise behind this work is in looking at what we have sometimes called interdisciplinarity. I noticed today that you were speaking in terms of crossing domains, and I like that. That makes me so happy, because since this film came out, I have been on more interdisciplinary panels around the world than I care to even mention. And I have seen one after another be a total fiasco of essentially channel surfing. That the disciplines bespeak their own itness and actually don't engage. So, unlike what happened at the Macy conferences, it's very, very difficult to get this kind of cross-patterning to take place. At one level, at another level, it's already happening. So this is taking me right into the material that I wanted to bring to you today. But I had an interesting experience earlier this year where I went to San Francisco to give a 3-day seminar, and it was in this systems studies, graduate students. And they sent me the brochure for what I was going to teach them, which is interesting that they didn't ask me, but that's okay. And the brochure said, Nora Bateson will come and offer a feminine perspective on complexity. What's that? I said to myself, uh-oh. So I called my feminist friends and I said, is there anything out there on feminism and complexity? Am I supposed to have a feminine perspective on complexity? And then I thought, what a fantastic question. What a great entry point into ways of looking at this. So I sat down with my beautiful group of graduate students on the day 1 of our session 1 of our feminine perspective on complexity, and I asked them, does anybody in this room have any idea what a feminine perspective on complexity is? And we all looked around like, we should know. I mean, it's something like, there's going to be intuition, and there's going to be relationship, and it's going to be softer somehow than something academic with formulas on the board, and it's going to be, wait a minute, what? So what came of that was a sort of realization that, yeah, okay, I'm a woman, it's true, but I'm also a lot of other descriptions. I'm a mother, I'm a filmmaker, I'm a traveler, I'm a writer, I'm a teacher, I'm a friend, I'm a not very good sleeper, I'm a cook, I'm a storyteller. How shall I separate the feminine side of myself from all those other sides so that I can give you the exactly feminine perspective on complexity? How shall I do that? No, not possible. So in that sense, I am just as complex as the world around me. My own identity is as filled with relationality as the world around me is. So the perspective that I can bring to my understanding of complexity is inherently complex and can't be reduced. I could say, or I could try to say, speaking as a representative of the female part of the species, I would like to declare complexity to be a, I don't know. But how authentic could I really be with that? Okay, so there's that piece of that. And the reason I bring that in is because there's a saying that was actually W.B.'s saying, William Bateson, and he said, genius can only be found in 2 places, in art and in nature. And while science should always be inspired by that genius, it could never achieve it. Now, I have an arts education, and I decided not to go into the sciences, so I was really happily personally vindicated by this statement because it made me feel like even though my ancestors were scientists, that I was okay too. But then I started to really think about why. Why is he saying that? What does that mean? Because it's not just a plug for the arts and the campers. There's something else at work here. And what's at work is that in art and in nature, there are multiple levels of relationality and communication coexisting across not only domains, but across epochs. So the aliveness, the genius, if you will, has to do with the processes in which all that relationality take place. Now, how does that like art? It's like art because do we have any art in this room? If you look at a painting, were any of you with me in the Tate? Yeah, we had a great day in the Tate. Sometimes I do these salons, these Bateson salons, and they're a lot of fun. Art offers us an invitation to study and to engage in a lot of different relationships. My sister was referring to in poetry, the relationship between the words and the rhythms. But also in painting, the relationship between the edge of the frame and the content, the colors and the shapes, the statement or the placement in an era, and how that era relates to us now. When I was a kid, I used to love to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and there's this floor-to-ceiling portrait of Mao Zedong by Andy Warhol. And he's got this smirk on his face. And when I was a kid, that portrait used to say, "This is the depiction of an arcane dictator." Now, with the emergence and the placement of China in the world, that portrait says something very different. And suddenly you walk in there and here's this 50-foot Mao, let's see how many meters is that, 15 meters of Mao, and he's smirking at you, and it sort of says, this is a guy with a plan, long term. So there's an evolving sense of relationship, an ongoing learning, a movement that can take place in art and in nature with multiple levels simultaneously. Okay, science doesn't do that. Science has a languaging process where it says what it means, and it means what it says, and it lays it out clearly, and it makes the point. And there's no room there. It doesn't mean that the inquiry and the research isn't a good practice. It just means that it can't be genius, because it's not coexisting. So in the work that I'm wanting to do right now, it's about looking at how contexts relate to each other, how different forms come together. This is a big question, so we're going to come back to it. I've given you part one, okay? Okay. There was another question. Wait, you had a question. You're afraid to ask now. I promise I won't go on for 20 minutes. He asked a really hard one.
It wasn't really a question, it was more of a reflection on your invitation at the beginning to invisible ink.
Good.
It was writing, but you couldn't see it. For me, the film was full of invisible writing. And there's connections, there's meaning there between whatever, there's various forms. And the challenge or the invitation from Gregory is to look for those words or those connections. That's what it meant to me. So thank you for giving me something to look for. Appreciate that.
That's great. Yeah, I think that, first of all, one of the processes that exists in Gregory's work, which was seminal in lots of different disciplines, in family therapy, in information theory, in ecology, in anthropology, and more, is his way of looking. And I started to tell you the sort of fragmented story of how he got going. And within that, it's very easy to lose track of what he was looking for. because what's happened is that his findings have gone back down into the silos. And the family therapists believed that he was a family therapist, and the anthropologists believed that he was an anthropologist, and the people working in information technology believe he was an information theorist. But they're still not talking. And in fact, being that Gregory came out of the household he did, he was trained as a child, as I was, as my children are, to be looking for the way that things are relating to each other. So when he went to study in Galapagos, or in New Guinea, or working with information technology and games theory in New York, or with schizophrenics or alcoholics or etc., all the time he's looking at the whole. And he's using these various lenses as forms of description. What does a system look like from this direction? What does it look like from that direction? So there's this very important piece of this work that is, the term is multiple description. So if you want to describe something, to begin to look at it from lots of different directions. And then you will never understand the thing completely, but you'll understand it more deeply with that in hand. So that question, in the beginning there's sort of 3 examples that I stacked up in the spirit of multiple description. I'm giving away my filmmaker secrets here. But I really wanted to get across this notion of relationship and how it works from many different directions. So I stacked the piece about hemoglobin, the piece about the hand, the piece about the table and your hand, and the piece about the family, hoping that I would catch you in one of those stories. How many people related to the hemoglobin story? How many people to the hand and the fingers? And the family? So that was what I wanted, was that people would begin to, if you could see it in one place, you could start to see it in other places. Okay, because if you go to a family therapy seminar, and you tell them that families are like hemoglobin, they don't like that. Or if you go and you start working with biologists and you tell them that the biology of your hand looks a whole lot like your sister's in-laws, they don't like that. Okay, we have a problem doing this process of cross-contextualizing, which is a little bit different than interdisciplinary in important ways. It's not the same thing. I'm not looking at this and saying, now I'm an anthropologist, now I'm an information theorist. I'm looking for patterns across contexts. That's different. So in my work right now, I was getting ready to say, and we can come around from this angle, I am on my way tomorrow morning to go to Bologna. And in Bologna, the first project of the International Bateson Institute is beginning, and it's called An Ecology of Food. And it stems from this notion of looking at systems in terms of ecology, because ecology is a good metaphor. But also because the word systems has been contaminated. And I very often find myself trying not to use that word, that somehow a system has become something that's kind of mechanized, and it's over there, and I can see it from here. But in the household that I grew up in, a system is something alive, it's something filled with relationships, and I'm in the middle of all of them. Not in a narcissistic way, but because there's no way out. So that process of observation is very different between looking at systems as being something that I can formalize, and systems as being something that I am within. So this kind of brings us back to this question of how do we bring in lots of different perspectives? How do we look at things from multiple directions? And that process is actually very much like an ecology. If we're working with ideas of an ecology of mind in which the thoughts in your head, your perceptions, your understandings are in relation to each other. So some of them are flourishing, and some of them are wilting, and some of them are harvesting, and some of them are composting, and some of them are, it's like a garden. So it's a working system in there. It's working. It's not fixed. And when people say, well, you can't change the way people think, well, that's really just an idea, isn't it? And maybe not a very good idea. Maybe that's a little bit like, DDT to the ecology of ideas. I think we'll avoid that thought, if possible. So then, to take that kind of premise and to put it into a conversation, into that coming together of multiple perspectives. So that what we're talking about is not what I said or what you said, but what happened with what we said. When you look at a pond, you can ask yourself, which part is the pond? Is it the water? Is it the fish? Is it the algae? Is it the insects? Is it the frogs? Is it the fisherman who goes there every day? Maybe it's the bank or the trees above. Which part is the pond? So to think about that pond as a conversation of relationality gives us then a different kind of metaphorical context to think about what human communication and societies can look like. What do systems look like in our world, and how can we start to generate new levels of understanding by looking at nature? This is why biology is really important to this work, because it's easy to get hung up on our humanness and forget to look in those ways. But this project in Bologna, an ecology of food, is premised exactly on this. So the story is that I was at a film premiere at the Gaia Institute here in London. And it was an honor to be invited, and all the who's who eco-celebrities were there. And there's nothing actually that I dislike more than eco-celebrities. It's just the worst. What a bunch of hypocrites. Oh. So anyway, I was at this thing with the eco who's who in this town. And it wouldn't have been any better if it were anywhere else. But there was a film they had made. It was about Monsanto sending seeds to Africa, and we know the story, but it was called Seeds of Freedom. If you get a chance, you can check it out. I can't say I overly recommend the film, but there it is. And what was interesting was that at the end of the film, there was a panel discussion. And one of the people on the panel was a young woman from Africa who had come, and she said the most important thing that I have heard in 10 years. She said this. She said, "This stuff on my plate, this is not food." And I thought, oh my God, that's it. She got it. That's the ticket. Now you're looking at me like, what? Did I miss something? She said when she was little, she used to sit with her mom in the fields, and she would put the seeds in her mouth, and her mom would put them in the earth. And they had a song. And then that the seeds were used in the ceremonies when people died. And that the seeds were part of the ceremonies when people got married. And what I realized was that stuff on her plate, that's not food. Food is a field of relationships, a context of relationships. And they need the people who weave the tablecloths, the people who are making communication with neighboring towns in distribution. It's a relationship between generations and the way that recipes and cooking is passed down. It's a relationship between the seasons. And if you want food, you don't put seeds on a boat and send them across the world. You build the network of relationships. And the food is part of that. And it's vast. It's economy, it's agriculture, it's cross-generational communication, it's food, it's the traditions, it's all these things. So how in the world are we ever going to think about that? Too many damn interconnections to think about, right? Too much complexity. So I was telling this story at a family therapy workshop in Italy, and an Italian therapist was there who worked with anorexia and bulimia. And he heard this story and he thought to himself, oh, I see. That stuff on the plate, that's not food. So where's the pathology in an eating disorder? If that's not food, then what? So it stops being about behavior and nutrition. And that whole concept stretched out into new dimensions where we can start to get completely different information. So this is why I'm going to Italy tomorrow. Because then he went and talked to the next person and the next person, and pretty soon we got this huge cross-sector research project going on an ecology of food, which is really exciting. But it comes back to this question of multiple description, which is really what I wanted to talk to you about today, and how multiple description functions in terms of how we get information and the way we think about systems. I've had this great privilege, as a few people in this room I think have shared with me, Caitlin in particular, of working with people from lots of different sectors. So I released this film. I thought 12 people were going to be interested. I was wrong. And I've spent the last few years working with anthropologists and ecologists and people in various ecology activist roles, with educators, with artists, with architects, many different people. And to have the privilege of being a visitor in all of these different fields is really a spectacular honor, because we don't often get to do that. And in doing so, I have had, it's both been very, very hopeful and also sad. Because what I see is that in each one of these fields, there's a desperate need and intent to try to enlarge the conversation, to try to understand more, to try to figure out how to interact in a more fruitful way. And yet to do so is somehow just out of reach. How are we going to do that? So that's part of the reason I wanted to start today by talking a little bit about the history of this process of cross-contextual work, of interdisciplinarity, of whatever you want to explain it as. Multiple description is the cleanest, I think. How do we get there? How do we do that? And what's stopping us? You know, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came out more than 50 years ago. And still, somehow the communication in the culture between the environmentalists and the rest of the way that we're functioning is not getting any traction. We're consuming more, we're making more mess. We have a kind of branding, if you will, around that sentiment. But why is it not moving? For those of us working in therapeutic worlds, there's only an increase now of people who are looking for direct causality, direct correctives, prescriptive drugs, diagnostics, and very linear, mechanical ways to address problems. Systems psychology, 50 years ago we were doing this. What's happened? Why can't we see the complexity we live in? What's in the invisible ink there? The space between the fingers, the pattern of relationship in the families, the way that the hemoglobin is in relationship with the organism and the environment. Why are we not able to describe that space? And in our inability to do that, or the blocks that are there, we're getting ourselves into trouble, right, left, and center. And I got a great example for you. So the thing is, the stakes are high. The pathologies, the problems are real. They make a kind of demand on us in terms of urgency of action and response. In some cases, you have the luxury of taking a step back and looking, but very often you're talking about whatever it is, a rainforest that's dying, a tribe that's disappearing, a teenage girl that's cutting herself. There's no time to mess around here. These are life and death issues. And the urgency itself is continuing to trigger our more mechanical responses. And that's really what I want to get to, is the very deep, deep metaphors that go so far back, that have to do with engineering, mass production, and industry. And that somehow those metaphors are at such a deep level that it's very, very difficult for us to get outside them. I mean, if you think, for example, about what an education system is, it's a whole lot like making a jar of jam. Okay, you put the jar in, you fill it up, you put the label on, you put the top on, you shoot the tip, you put it in the box, and you ship it out for distribution. That's pretty much the same thing I did with my kids. That somehow this notion of industry and the way things move through a system is very mechanical. And that if you want to intercept that system, you intercept it in ways that are direct. But you guys are clean change people, and you work in metaphors, so you know that there's more to it than that. And there's that great scene in the film where Stuart Brand says, if you poke a system here, it doesn't respond there, it responds that way, or in some unintended direction. And this is very much how systems in nature work, because they're operating at multiple levels simultaneously. And art too, multiple levels, many of which are far above, beneath, beyond our ability to perceive, thank God. But that, a lot of them we don't see. So, my son was at this performance art high school in Southern California. And performance arts high school in Southern California, as you might suspect, have a little bit of a marijuana problem. It should really come as no surprise. So I was talking to my son, his name is Trevor, about his school, and he was very concerned because he had a friend who got busted smoking a cigarette and then got given a drug test.
a urine drug test. And I said, oh dear, then what happened? Did he pass? What happened? And he said, well, of course he passed. Of course he passed. Why did he pass? And he said, oh, because he had a Whizzinator. A what? He had a Whizzinator, Mom. Of course, everybody's got a Whizzinator. I mean, if they're going to have drug tests, we have to have Whizzinators, right? So, okay, you can Google this. A Whizzinator is a plastic penis, and it comes with a tube and a little pack of synthetic, just add water urine. Okay? This is what happens when you make a direct corrective to a non-linear system, communication, living set of relationships. Doesn't work. Okay, so he had a Whizzinator. Yeah, you know, but all the rest of us, we had to give ours up. He did. Yeah, because the teachers found out about the Whizzinators. And because some kid bought the wrong race. Okay, this is complexity in action. You can't make this up. Okay, so then what happened? Well, then they had a special day at school, and it was Whizzinator Amnesty Day. You would think that it might have started to occur to them that they were off topic at the point when they started having Whizzinator Amnesty Days at school. Okay, so you're supposed to bring in your Whizzinator, throw it out, and no one's going to ask any questions, no one's going to tell, and everything's going to be good from now on. Just now, if you get caught with your Whizzinator, you're in big trouble. Okay, but now what, Trevor? He says, oh, well, you know, all along the girls were using niacin. The girls didn't have Whizzinators, you know, it's just complexity from a feminine perspective. So they were taking niacin. Do you call it niacin? It's some sort of high-level B vitamin. Does anybody have an explanation of what niacin is?
Yes, B12.
B12. Okay, super high levels of B12 or 6, and for some reason that washes the THC out of your body. But it's not so very good for you, actually. And then what happened, of course, is that they found out about the niacin. So then the kids go online, and they're getting some other God knows what set of pills that they're taking to get rid of the THC so that they can do the urine test, and now after the urine test they have to do a victory dance to prove that it's actually attached. And so I said, oh, this is a problem on so many levels. And he said, yeah, it's kind of ugly. So I called the headmaster and I said, I would like to have a conversation with you, because I think you have a problem in the culture of your school. No, we don't have a drug culture. No, that's not what I'm trying to say here. The thing is, what happens when you have the artists? These are the artists. These are the people who are going to make cultural reflection. These are the change makers. These are the people from whom we hope to better see the edges of our frame. What happens when you normalize for them the behavior of a police state? What happens when that's normal? They should be up in arms. They should be furious. They should feel violated. But they don't. They feel like buying Whizzinators. And here you have it. So that's an example of what happens when we don't see the complexity of the situation, when we aren't interacting with the set of relationships. But the stakes are high. You know, the headmaster said, well, we had a kid that almost died of an overdose. We've got 400 kids on this campus, and it's our responsibility to find out whether or not they're doing drugs, and they lie. Huh. Who knew? So that's his side of the story. And that in order to protect their insurance, their this, their that, they have to show that they're doing everything within their power to get control of the situation. And that means implementing drug tests. So where's the problem?
The kids are getting drugs to counteract that, which are really dangerous.
And the problem, is the problem in the kids? Is the problem in the internet where you can get the anti-drug test materials? Is the problem in the drug test manufacturers? Is it in the parents that are going to sue the school? Is it in, where's the problem? Right. It's a little bit like the question of food. Where's the drug problem? How many different sectors are we going to have to work on to address this? To look at it from lots of different directions and begin to find our way. Because clearly it's not stopping the kids from doing drugs. There's no point at which we can look at the scenario and say, yeah, but it's working. We're having amnesty Wizinator days.
Because we're in a war metaphor.
We're in a war metaphor. We're in a war. And because the relationship expectations between the generations are in a mixed up state. That's the nicest way that I can put that. And I think this is where I wanted to go next with this, is that when William left Cambridge, that was a huge statement. And it was enormously courageous because he stepped away from all his colleagues. He stepped away from Cambridge. He was under extreme ridicule. He went on to publish a book called Variations. Anyway, and that book describes the relationship inside an environment or an organism as something that's happening in vibrations. Not as in the California kind, but as in a form of communication, like music. That biological organisms are in a semiotic state of communicating within and without. And he was mocked, absolutely mocked for this. And the geneticists threw him out the window, and everybody threw him out the window. Poor William. But he was brave, and he stuck to it. And actually, I recently got a call from a biomedical center in Sheffield. And they said, is it okay if we name our institute the Bateson Institute? And I said, what are you doing? And so, no, the Bateson Center. I'm the Bateson Institute, they're the Bateson Center. And they explained that they were working on genetic stuff and this and that. And they said, because you know, your grandfather was one of the most important scientists of the last 100 years and nobody knows who he is. So we want to name our institute after your grandfather. And I said, well, that's great, because I just started doing this stuff on Gregory and da-da-da. And they said, who? It takes an enormous amount of courage. It's really not so difficult to stand here and talk about how systems require lots of different directions, and we have to have an ecology of communication, and we're going to build this thing, and it's going to be beautiful. But in order to do that, there's a fairly radical relationship shift with the culture that we live within. Right down to other people doing systems therapy and systems ecology and working with complexity and all of this. What I'm finding very frequently at this point is that people talk about systems. But they're actually still doing mechanism. They're just using systems terminology. And that's a very slippery slope. And the ability to keep your eyes open for that one means not being very popular with even your own people. And you see, Gregory's work included something tremendously important and tremendously difficult, and I think it works well with this group. And it was the concept that he referred to as conscious purpose. The thing about conscious purpose, especially if you're working in the therapeutic world, is that it's a warning to look out for fixing things. If your conscious purpose is that I'm gonna fix you, or I'm gonna fix these relationships with food, or I'm gonna fix that school, I'm in trouble. And the reason is that I see this much. I have my perceptual lens, my cognitive processes can only see a little window. And what it occurs to me that might be right for you or for these other things may not be part of a larger system story that goes across thousands of years. I don't know if it's a good idea to save those sequoias. Maybe they're not, their disappearance is part of some other emergence. How can I know that? And yet, that position of humility and not knowing can easily be read as a sort of cop-out, as a way to say, well, you know, it's not my business, I can't know what's good for you, so I'm not going to do anything at all, because it's, I don't know, who am I? So that's a sort of a state of paralysis that can be the flip side of that. Or the other side of that, which is that the question of what do you do? How do we behave? I'm getting the 10-minute mark. How do we interact with the complex world that we live in? That is a question that every day and every minute asks us to pay attention to those relationships. When does it matter? All day, every day. Where does it matter? Everywhere. I'm going to tell you one last story. Two. Because I only have 10 minutes. I'm going to be quick. Okay. One of them is getting back to this question of the relationship between the generations, because this is really important and it's a good marker for looking at ways in which our thinking is blocking relational communication. Okay? So my daughter hosted at her university a screening of my film. It was so cool. And she did an introduction. She came off stage. I was, of course, melting. But she said to me, okay, Mom, she got right in my face. She said, don't you dare go out there and tell those kids that the future's in their hands. We are so sick of that shit. And I said, okay. And she said, yeah, because you're the one that taught me. We're in relationship. And if you want to see the next generation make changes, you make space for that change. So how do we do that? How can we begin to step back from the institutions that we would like to see change, but we're busy upholding? And make space for these next generations, because that's our job. We got the keys to the castle. We can't be looking at them to say, so when are you going to storm us? So that's one story I wanted to tell you. The other story I want to tell you is about what it means to, just a quick example, because I've given you a negative perception of what it means to interact badly with a system. I'm going to give you a positive now. So, unlike my son's school, my friend Jim, he met this gorgeous Swedish woman, and he and this Swedish woman got together in the early 70s in New York City, and Jim's family was Catholic. And very prominent, high-profile family, in which to have premarital, affairs would have been dangerous to their reputation, destructive to the family's position, and so on and so forth. And his mother was very concerned, and one day the mother comes to the apartment that Jim is renting, and she's helping Jim set up the double bed. Well, we all know what's going to happen in that double bed. And so here's this moment when Jim's mother could address one level of the situation, okay? The level that she's living at is a lot like the level that that headmaster is living at in the school, okay? Her reputation is at stake, the family's credibility, the position with the church, And the impulse is, of course, for her to say something to the effect of, you need to be aware of what you're going to do to the family, and this and that and this and that and this and that, right? But what she said to Jim was this. She said, if you hurt that girl, you're no son of mine. And so I said to Jim, I bet you didn't have to rebel against your mother, did you? And he said, no, I never did. And I said, yes, she didn't abuse her authority. She got the right level. All that extraneous stuff did not matter as much as the relationship. Where's the relationship? How do we hold that sacred? Because from there, the other things will sort. 40-something years later, those two are still married. Just thought I'd share that with you. But that's an example of addressing a situation at a level that's productive, as opposed to drug tests for teenagers. It's a good sort of balance there. I believe that I'm out of time. And I just want to thank you so much for having me. And what a great group. Keep up the good work. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely.
I'd like to say that what that happened there is the nearest thing to a standing ovation you get in England.
I love it.